Well, welcome back, everyone, for the last session of the day. We're very excited always to have these discussion panel sessions in our conference. I'm Jack Ashby, one of the trustees of NatSCA and the Assistant Director of the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And it's been my pleasure for the last 3 years to be doing these sessions. The first one was our NatSCA grandees, a run through kind of careers in natural history from some of our big, grandees. And then last year, we're looking at major exhibition developments in natural history collections. And this year, I'm very excited that we're making the most of being here in Manchester to learn from some of the leaders in our view. I don't think anyone would argue they're kind of leaders in the sector in this topic of Indigenous perspectives and kind of looking at colonial legacies in natural history museums and how to address them more equitably. So we've got 55 minutes left for this session. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from 2 wonderful speakers, and then we'll all 3 pop up again onto this front, and we'll have a kind of a panel discussion. So be thinking of questions and discussion and comments, and it will be a conversation as much as a Q&A. So please do think about what you want to contribute. Our 2 speakers are George Young, who is the Head of Exhibitions and Collections here at the Manchester Museum, and Alexandra Alberda, who is Curator of Indigenous Perspectives and the Deputy Head of Collections here. So without any further ado, George, over to you.
Feel free to start.
Hello. I will start. That's very casual. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of this work, and then Alex will go into a little bit more of a detailed case study, which will probably feel a bit more grounded, but you sort of need to place it within the museum and its story to understand where it comes from. So what I will say at the beginning is we are asking all of the NatSCA audience in the room and online to join us and respect and honour Indigenous rights. The images and films that are shown during this presentation don't belong to us. Their reuse is not down to me, it's not down to Alex, it's down to the people to whom they belong. So please, respect that the rights in this work sit with the Indigenous people who we've worked with. On that note, we've never had cultural rights to their belongings. We might have had ownership, but we never had cultural rights. And we no longer legally own some of the things we'll be talking about either. So we can talk about the process of return, but there will be bits that we can't talk about because it's not our knowledge to share. It's not our knowledge to hold. It's not our knowledge to impart to you, but we can tell you about the museum side of things. And we can tell you about how humanities and natural sciences have worked together in this institution. So hopefully there's enough in that. And in fact, there's more than enough. We could talk for hours and we will try not to. I'm just going to move this to show you a picture, if I can. Spacebar. There we go. Just so that there's something that's not text on the screen to start with. So the image on the screen shows what are known as daddy quack quack quack. These are going to be a bit of an anchor throughout this afternoon, but you might not know what they are now. You will by the end. And these are among 174 items of cultural property that Manchester Museum returned to the Anilyakwa people of Groote Island and the Groote Archipelago, which is about 40 miles off the north coast of Australia if you fly out of Darwin. These were returned in September 2023, October 2023, autumn 2023. And yeah, they're going to come through the presentation. So I'm going to start with them now. But before we properly meet them, and I am referring to them as people, before we properly meet them, a bit about Manchester Museum that will help set everything else into context. We've been here since the 1880s on this site, and we've been the University of Manchester's museum since that time. But some of you may well know that before that, we come from the Manchester Natural History Society's museum. So in the very first instance, this museum was a natural history museum. And you'll also have noticed the resemblance between our original building and the Natural History Museum in London. It was the same architect. It's very much, in its initial concept, a natural history museum. And it's only over time that the encyclopedic nature and the human cultures were added. And it started with collections from Egypt and Sudan. and then kind of follows the contours of empire, if you like. So the coverage of our collection and the coverage of the British Empire are pretty aligned, and there's a reason for that. And the kind of the peaks of collecting also align with the peak of imperial power, or a little bit of a lag afterwards to allow for the sort of process of things coming into the museum. So we are a creature of colonialism as a museum, and we acknowledge that pretty openly. And we launched the Decolonising Trail last night, which you may well have seen around the museum as well. So we are addressing colonialism in lots and lots of different ways across the collections. But today we're going to talk to you about indigenisation specifically, and the work of repatriation that we've done. So I'm going to do a bit of acknowledgement to Sam Alberti at this point, because I'm going to talk about nature and culture. And you can't talk about nature and culture in this museum without referencing his book, which if you haven't read it is excellent. But there was a really hard dividing line between nature and culture. It may well have claimed to be an encyclopedic museum. It may well have had collections that were human cultures and natural sciences, but there was quite a tough line between them. And that tough line was maintained in public. So effectively, if you walk through the museum now, roughly where you go over the link bridge, that's the divide. So it was quite a hard line. That side is natural sciences, this side is human cultures. And it was reflected in the behind the scenes of the museum as well. So the way that the collections were cared for, categorised, separated out. And it's quite thoroughgoing. It's been very enduring, and it's still kind of there, much as we'd like to pretend it isn't. It is. But I suppose I just want to illustrate how that divide doesn't really serve us all the time, especially now what Manchester Museum is trying to do is build understanding between cultures and a more sustainable world. What I'm going to say is look at these, and what do you see? So do you see a shell? Do you see a doll? Do you see an artwork? Do you see a person? And the thing is, these are all of those things. They are all of those things. They're not one of those things, and no one of those things is privileged. And actually, only in the way that I express it and the way that I categorise it as a curator are those all separate. And from the viewpoint of the people who made them, the way I just divided it up doesn't make any sense. So it's just about that kind of, the first step of kind of breaking down the disciplinary boundaries is to understand that they are a construct. They are a construct. They are useful sometimes, but they are not the only way of looking. And what we've done over the last 5 years is a programme called Indigenising Manchester Museum, where we've kind of trained and untrained the whole curatorial team to think slightly differently about expertise and about understanding and about knowledge and about who has the right to speak about something and who doesn't, and about where the limits of disciplinary expertise are and where disciplinary expertise is really helpful. And I would like to say disciplinary expertise remains really helpful. In the context of NatSCA, we're not saying it isn't. And I suppose in the context of this return, of which these shell dolls were a part, we couldn't have done it without someone who identified what every species was, because you can't export these back to Australia unless you know what they are. So very straightforwardly, taxonomically needed to know what species those were to get them out of the country. And we couldn't have honoured the ceremonies that needed to happen without the botanical knowledge of what plants could be used for the smoking ceremony that were available in the UK and seemed akin to what would have been used in Australia. So in a very, very practical way, natural sciences expertise is kind of weaved through this work. And it's not that we don't see the boundaries, but it's just that we kind of pay heed to them and know when we need to lean into the specialism and when we need to let it go. And that's, I suppose, the thing that sort of will come through a little bit more. So expertise remains important, but only if you wear it lightly, only if you approach it with some curatorial humility, only if you lean into the multidisciplinary collaboration, and only if you acknowledge the cultural rights and knowledge of the people to whom these things belong. So you might see them as shells, you might see them as dolls, you might see them as artwork, you might see them as people. What you can't see them as is what they were as a lived culture, because it's not yours. not your culture. And we will never know more about that than the people whose culture is. So there's always a point where you have to step back and you can't know more than they do. And you will never will. What I will say is it was very much seen as a humanities endeavour in the first instance. So when we first started returning collections again, we'd been returning ancestors since the late 90s in this museum. But when we first sort of started on the process of returns with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, it was very much sat within the humanities part of the team. In fact, it was sat probably with about 3 people. And after the first return that we did in 2019, and which was a group of sacred ceremonial material that went back to 5 different Indigenous groups, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, the learning from that was that actually only a few people being involved was doing the museum a disservice, and it was not helping us to move forward. And one of the things that we did, and this is where Alex is going to pick up the story, is we created a programme called Indigenising Manchester Museum, where we tried to open out what had been learnt by 3 people in the process of 1 return and kind of bring it across the team, across the specialisms, across the museum, to kind of mean that everyone in the museum had that kind of Indigenous understanding to a point, up to the point that they could. And so we kind of, after the return that happened in 2019, we launched a programme called the Indigenising Manchester Museum, which has now been running for nearly 5 years. And we appointed a curator of Indigenous perspectives, which is Alex, who's going to talk to you next. And she will talk to you a little bit about what that means as a post holder and within this institution. But what I will say is just a very quick run through of the returns, because this is like an anchor for you. The first thing that happened was the shells were in a tray, like I showed you in the first picture. They were part of our collection. They were relatively well provenanced. The anidiliac material was part of a defined collection. We sent everything we had. We sent pictures, information across to Groote Eylandt with IATSIS as partners, and shared what we had. We then got invited to the island. You can't go to Groote Eylandt without an invitation. It's their land. And this is the senior men who we met with first to determine what the approach to consultation on the island should be. So that's my former colleague Njabu is third from left, and that's a combination of people from Anadolu Land Council, IATSIS, and the senior men. That's who they are. This is us doing consultation. It looks quite nice, I admit. So one of the things we did was sit on the beach with several generations and talk through what we had. And what we did, we had our computers, we had all of our information, and we just scrolled through and showed and shared and talked and let them talk about what it meant to them. And there was no sort of, it has to be returned at this point. It was really just a kind of sharing. And this is Umbercumber Beach, which is becomes more important when you understand more about the dolls that I showed at the beginning. And we did about a week of consultation on the island in various settings, this being probably the most picturesque. And then we left. And then we finished off the Hello Future project and did a load of galleries. And IATSIS wrote up the report of what we'd learned from the island. And then approximately more or less about the day that we opened the museum, we got a return request, like proper repatriation request for the material. And I'm going to sort of leave it at that point because I've spoken for 10 minutes already, and I can go on and hand over to Alex to pick up what happened next.
Amazing. Thanks, George. So my name's Alex. I am part white and part Jemez of Pueblo, which is from New Mexico area. That becomes important when we talk about indigenization. But to quickly get to this point, that's the consultation. So we got the formal request, but at the same time, we also got something super, super exciting. And that was when we were on that beach in Umbacumba, when the pictures on the iPad and the print-offs came up of the daddy kwa kwa kwa, no one was really sure what they were, except for, and this is a term of respect, the old ladies knew and started giggling and opening up. And even the artists that were there, which we'd say is probably middle age and young, they had no idea what was going on. And that was because those old ladies were some of the last people on the island that knew what the daddy kwa 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 were. And can you imagine kind of retelling a story of toys on the island while you're with children on a beach who only know plastic toys that came in with the missionaries? And it was such a conversation that was going across different groups and sharing that and getting kids to think in there. And so then we left. And about the time we got the return request, we also got told that Nolene Lalara, one of the senior ladies in the Art Center, culturally revitalized the Daddy Kwa Kwa Kwa. So this is from a display they had in Darwin as part of the Aboriginal Artist Awards in the Northern Territory. That happens every year. And we make no claim in that, right? Because we just had a conversation. We showed up there and left. But then hearing about how hundreds of these dolls were being revitalized across the island, being shared, is just absolutely fantastic. So this was very exciting to hear, because you never expect these types of things to happen, and you shouldn't be going in with that spirit. Your spirit should be in connecting people with their ancestors and their cultural heritage and their natural history. But it revitalized that process of finding the materials, bringing back, and learning from the old people, which is a term for ancestor. So that was very cool. And what was also really important was that, again, when knowledge sits with a few people, how does that change all the other people? We have I always say about 100 people. That might not be accurate all the times at Manchester Museum, but when we got the formal report, we asked, because much of that was open material. And so the material that was open, we were able to share that report that IATSIS had made, that the partners had approved, with every single person at the museum. It didn't matter what team you were on. And then we had a collective collections development meeting where everyone at the museum was a part of approving this and asking the questions to make sure it was successful that might be critical. And making that plan. So it wasn't a decision made by individuals. It wasn't a decision made by a board somewhere else. The decision after that formal request was made by all of Manchester Museum who were here at the point. And that was really important, because if you want change, and I'm really into change, I'm really into epistemic injustice and breaking that down. That's kind of my background, is you need that. You need everyone's different perspectives to be able to find those solutions together, to bring those expertise, but also to come to the door and say, my expertise doesn't help me be in this room comfortably. What can I learn to be able to do that? And so that was really important. So then they came. Nolene is there. So that's Nolene, and then Macy is next to her, and Amathea is behind her. And they came from Anandaliako with all of the other representatives from IATSIS, the Australian High Commissioner. And a part of also sharing that was, how do you want to? Because returns don't always have to be huge media stories. And in fact, it should be about what your Indigenous partners want. They wanted to influence the world. They wanted to bring in agency. So this was really important, this handover ceremony being quite public and bringing people together. And so that was really good. But like George said, we had smoking ceremonies. If you want to be doing this work, you all need to get a fire pit that you use indoors. It's possible. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't, because it is, and that's really important. So I have a fire pit under my desk, and I have a bunch of dried different plants that the curator of botany, Rachel Webster, had collected for these types of ceremonies in case things couldn't come from international places. So you need that. You need your collection from your botanists. You need your fire pit, and that's how you do this work with heart. And so we had this, and as part of this, they actually gifted us 12 shell dolls, which we didn't expect anything. We do have a relational approach. So a lot of times these things can feel quite transactional. So you go through the stages and that's done, you're on to the next thing. But a relational approach asks you to consider what's beyond. One of my first meetings with George on repatriation, I always bring this up, but it was so good, was George said, it's not, unconditional return is thought as like the gold star, but it's actually not good enough. And I went, oh my goodness, what's coming next? And she said, because just us returning does not repair or lead to the reconciliation of the long history of what collections have, what the different academic, scientific, humanities-based disciplines went through. So we do have to be open to what that relationship is beyond. Some people won't want that, and that's perfectly fine. But we try to keep that quite open and say, what's happening next? And getting a gift of Daddy Kwa 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 did mean we couldn't just put them back into the care they were in before, even if we were using our best care practices. And so what I really liked was, we'll just go back to Nolene for a second. So I did ask Nolene, what do we do? How do we care for them? Because they're all those things George mentioned. And she said, well, you have to talk to them when you see them and you handle them. Because you wouldn't just touch a person without consent or talking. I mean, that's a lesson for everyone. You wouldn't do that. And so you wouldn't do that with the Daddy Kwa Kwa Kwa. And so that was really important, was that. And I went, yes, of course. And she said, and also they must come out to play. So that was really important. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but that changed everything. And that was written into their acquisition paperwork as a condition. So it's not just something that we hold, but legally it's written in that if we were to leave and someone else comes in, that frankly, I don't think would be hired by Manchester Museum, and decided to change these types of things, then actually it's legally there to protect them, to say we're no longer being honored. And so that was important. But just to give a flavor, and let's see, Alt Tab. Oh no, I don't know what I just did. What? Is it that one?
You tell me.
Perfect. Okay. Amazing. So this was, but also while they were here, because they're artists, in that relational approach is what can we do? And so they ran workshops for women to learn about making Daddy Kwa Kwa Kwa. So there's a bit of that in the background of just this return video.
This week we've been in Manchester to return 174 cultural heritage items to the Indeliaqua people.
IATSIS tells the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we hope that the nation, Australia, and those outside around the world can be transformed by that story.
Basically what we did was we wrote to collecting institutions throughout the world and asked the question, would you be willing to consider a return request from an Indigenous community?
And Manchester Museum, there's a big collection of Indeliaqua material here.
To get our things and take them home, it's like really, the things means to us. It's got lots of stories. It makes us sad, cry when we see it the first time. Yeah. To me, I'm a bit emotionally to seeing the artifacts. They took the artwork from our ancestors. I'm so proud that I'm taking the artifacts back home.
You can see that it can help support a community in their cultural expressions.
Doll shells have not been made for 50 or 60 years, and as a result of this return from Manchester Museum, Indeliaqua women have started making the doll shells again.
Yeah, the shell dolls, we call them with their language Tatakokoka, and the shell dolls is got means to us.
This was an excellent opportunity to get to know Indigenous artists coming from Australia, completely the other side of the world. Incredibly fantastic to just try to make myself these dolls and to learn from the artists themselves the type of fibers that they are using.
My idea was to create some waves and the bubbles, and later the Australian teacher said, yeah, you can make 2 eyes on the top. So I did.
Yeah, all the families back home, they proud, happy, it's emotional, you know.
Anyone that was at the return event on Tuesday this week, I think, saw the significance of the returning cultural heritage material.
It's a tangible thing that can connect somebody to their grandmother, their grandfather, their great-grandparents.
And we're happy. I don't know how we still got our language for 8,000 years.
The indigenous culture is kept very well, yes, and keep going.
So we keep on carrying it on, make it alive, to follow our ancestors' foot track. Yeah.
Perfect. So that was really important. I wanted to hear some of their words rather than just ours today. But it was really important to have that moment and to have the smoking ceremony and then to get objects back. So I went because there had to be a cultural ceremony that involved someone from the museum on country to also say the things like we are returning, to be that representative and to do that. And that was for community. So back on Umbacumba Beach, where you had seen us before, we had a barbecue. We had brisket cooking for 3 days. It was amazing. There was dance, ceremony, and lots of life and community. And of course, there was the moment where Nolene took the signature as it went over. And you can see George is there. So that moment that has to happen was also integrated into their cultural practices and really important in sharing that and being able to be there. So there's actually like quite a few people behind this on the other side. But it's also about that relationship. So it was quite cool that actually by circumstances, other people were supposed to be doing some of these parts, but it ended up being me and Nolene who'd been working with each other for so long. So it was nice. But what was also really important about that day was that people who weren't able to be part of those 3 women that came to Manchester also got to come see the heritage material. So it was returned. This is different than sometimes it getting returned to direct people because there's so many family here, is that they actually are creating spaces where these will be held that all community can access. So this is Philip, and Philip got to come and hold the boomerang that his father made. And other people had those moments too that we hadn't necessarily been able to reach in the first consultation, who came to the party, of course, because, you know, when you're cooking something on the beach for 3 days, people are coming to the party. But it was really beautiful, the moments of people just connecting and being able to touch the things. And there was a man who immediately recognized that we hadn't talked to at first, that was what his grandfather had made. That was the patterns and how his grandfather made those. And it was just a beautiful day. I also shoveled a lot of sand that day because that was my job on that day. But it was really great because you get stuck in. And that's the important thing, is you don't step off to the side. Get stuck in. And if you're coming to my tour tomorrow of the gallery that I'll show you some snippets of, I can tell you a bit more of how we got stuck in and became a part of that to build those genuine relationships, but to learn importantly about the place. Because for Indigenous cultures, that is so much about our place and where our country is, where our homeland is. And you can't take our identities, our culture, and just pick it up somewhere else. And that's where the natural history side of things becomes so prevalent in everything that you do, is because it has to come from those places that you're coming from. The stuff that I'm about to show you and the stuff that was a part of the return almost could only be made on Groot Island. And you see that reflected as you're walking through country and as you're seeing all these different spaces and getting the privilege to do that. So not only did I have to ask about conservation and Indigenous conservation, which I'll get to in a second, George also tasked me with, well, what do they want to do beyond? Not just the care of the things that came. And because we'd been working with so many artists, that was a display. So this has just opened at the beginning of April. But what you will see downstairs, and if you come to the tour, but if you are going to another one, I accept that, is that a display across 2 cases that I walked through their art center, and Nolene and other artists told me, this is the story you'll tell, and these are the things you'll buy to tell that story, and you're going to display it like this with the pictures of country. So they did the first text, they did the first layouts, and in a lot of indigenization, and this is really important, I forgot to define that, indigenization is change led by Indigenous people. If you're not Indigenous and representing your culture in the action you're doing, then that's not indigenization. A museum, a collection, you can't claim to do indigenizing work without the leadership of Indigenous people. And not just random Indigenous people. I count sometimes, I don't other times. It is about the people for whom that's their cultural heritage, their traditional ecological knowledge, and their land. And so that's where we're finding those differences, where we're moving from the center of decision making and having that happen. So I came with my sketchbook, and I sketched out the ideas that everyone said, and we presented them as different artists came in and out of their art center, and got the shopping list. Luckily, I was sent with a company card and a budget, which is always nice. And I actually took those spears through customs. I'll tell you about that tomorrow. But it was really important to be able to do that. They're artworks, they're sculptures. But in that was actually going through and having that design. And because they're artists, they've displayed before. And so what did they like from that? And then using our skills, not always our expertise, but our skills to help make that happen. And that's the really humbling part of finding your feet. But it wasn't just the artworks that were made, it was other things that they did that made this process so much easier. So we talked about how we needed scientific expertise, and actually our number one go-to, because Groot Island, and I feel like I should have number checked this, but much of the species on the island are not actually formally recorded yet. And so it's only a small percentage. And so if you have 174 objects, and for a CITES, you have to list all of these wood objects and what wood it is and all of that. If you have an area that hasn't been recorded, well, actually, the most amazing thing was George bought this dictionary when we were on the island, and inside this dictionary is not only the traditional words, but descriptions of when they were used and for what materials. And this was amazing because there wasn't actually loads of scientific reports that we could go to in order to identify stuff. Often we went through here and then used it and what knowledge there was out there to kind of reaffirm what they had done in this really extensive, beautiful dictionary work. And so you can buy it. I don't know if it's available online, but you can buy it from Groot Island. So maybe the next time you're running through there, you'll just pick one up. But it was amazing. And it was thinking about how do we do this kind of provenance work from the natural history side in an area that might not be recorded in that way, was thinking creatively. And luckily we had this. But just to tease out some different things. But everything that they make has these different connections to their landscape and their natural, kind of what some people might say resource, but actually it's the different materials and country that comes together to reflect that. From bush dye, what my nieces and nephews say, is your t-shirt dirty? But actually, this is the most expensive t-shirt I own because this is desert peach bush dye from the Anadiliaqua, and using these different types of materials and coming together on the island to collect them. But also what I will get to before I do a little teaser is a part of that return is we actually chose to open this display while the Daddy Kwa 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 were off to play. So instead of waiting until the play session conservation obligation had happened, it was, we're going to open with a sign that says it's not quite finished, but why? And so that was the Daddy Kwa 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 come out to play. And I am also one of the experts in the building on how to make the perfect moist sand for sandcastles. And that's what you learn when you're doing Indigenous conservation, because it's different. And so we had lots of kids come in and they each met and got to speak with and play with different sets of those Daddy Kwa 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 in their own individual sandboxes. And some of them were toddlers. We have now developed the toddler box, but we also let them play with that. But it was get in there because that's where life happens. If things start to get covered in sand, if all those other things happen, that is perfectly fine because that's life. And I did know, I asked Nolene after she said this, it wasn't so much for me, but I knew I had to ask Gavin, Nolene, but when they come out to play, what happens if they break? And she looked at me and said, they're toys, they're going to. And that was really important because that's a part of the life, because the more they come out to play, the more love they have, because there's nothing sadder than putting a toy behind glass and a kid can't reach it. That just is really sad to me. And so actually having that play and putting that in as part of requirement. So if you're around in Manchester on the Easter holidays, it should be an annual thing. And it is quite fun. So that it's just really getting in there. Perfect. I'm going to skip quickly past these, but I can always bring them back later or show you tomorrow on the tour. We did do an interview with kids so that they could ask the important questions. But I'm going to end on this little teaser and just say one thing I didn't talk about, but if you're doing the tour tomorrow with Wild, curator of botany, Rachel Webster, will be able to talk to you more about this, but it's not only about repatriation and sharing space and knowledge, it's also about how we prioritize work in our collections. And so there's been a lot of work that Rachel will talk about within the botany collection, working with the Noongar Nation in Australia, because they've gotten Naunup back, which is part of their traditional homeland that was monocrop farm to desert. And again, it was this, you have all these areas that you know are so biodiverse, but where's the records for what was there if colonialism comes in and destroys land to the point where you don't know exactly what eucalyptus tree was there before? And so they've been doing a lot of work on their own, but we also have been working with our collections to try to find historical records of what species might have been there because of our time. But I will let Rachel do a bit more on that one tomorrow, so you'll have to stick around for that. But thank you so much.
There with me. My laptop died at the worst possible moment.
Might be one of the mics.
Who's very good? Sorry. Be thinking of things to ask. We're transitioning now. For me, I guess museums are about making meaning, right? That's what we do. And I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I was so privileged to be there for the return of the regal spears to the Bruce community. These spears that had been held by the University of Cambridge for well over 150 years, I forget how many years, long time, that had been stolen by James Cook when the British first arrived on the beach in Canmay, Botany Bay. And like I have never seen a more meaningful thing in a museum. And it was obvious that those objects, those spears, meant so much more to the Lapperouse community than they did to anyone in the UK, even if people in the UK, they meant a lot to it. I think for me, you've just shown like that it was clear how much those Daddy meant to the Anindalaxo people, that it was like, what more powerful thing could a museum be doing than kind of living up to that meaning and seeing where it's valued. Let's start on the floor. Does anyone have anything they want to ask? Jan at the back there.
Yeah, thanks. It's an absolutely amazing story. I was just wondering, in the process, was there anything that you would have liked to have been able to deliver to the community that you weren't able to in terms of the whole process?
Start. So we did return everything Anindaliakwa that we had. There was nothing that was retained in the museum. The only things that the museum now has on site are things that have been agreed post the return, though in that new.
So they were not just objects, like in terms of, you know, how we might like to have gone about things, as well as, well.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to pick it up? I mean, basically, there is always more. The sort of, and there is a limit to what the museum can do, and there is a limit to the spaces the museum should step into. But there are definitely questions arising, just as there were questions after the first return about, is this the limit of what we can do? Is there more can we go further and differently? And actually the answer is different for every single time. So there isn't one formula, but do you want to pick up and say anything specifically that you think we could have done more in this instance?
I think because we were working with IATSIS, who are a wonderful kind of like partner to have in this kind of work, is that when something didn't work, you didn't just leave it, because they have the Return of Cultural Heritage program. So that was an opportunity to rethink what we were doing, because first the consultations were actually happening or trying to happen online, and it just wasn't working. I mean, that was the tail end of COVID. Internet isn't always the best when a storm can come in and the island doesn't have internet for a few weeks. And so it wasn't working. And I think at times, if we were in a different situation, that might have stalled us. But because of where we were at, we were able to rethink what was needed. And that was when they came to us and said, well, why don't you come here? And we went, well, why don't we come here? I mean, okay. So I think we were in a really privileged position to be able to meet some of those stumbling blocks that if you aren't in that position, you have to rethink and it might stall you for a while. But I think it was kind of changing what we were able to do, sitting down and rethinking, okay, what are our budgets and how can we make this work? Because we have this. So I think it was being open. So there was a few things that could have caught us, but I think we had really good partners and a really good will to just find creative solutions. We should say that there was 3 gramophone records that we also had that had traditional songs, but they weren't interested in them because they were just copies and quite degraded copies. And IATSIS actually had beautiful copies. So they just said, oh, they'll just send us the CD. So they did get that too, but they weren't necessarily interested in the old records. But there's always more you can do around programming, or especially if you're working with artists and you're a museum, you kind of think, oh, well, we could commission things and we could do all of this. And sometimes it's also you recognizing that you might not be the only one interested in working with them. So I think there's lots of things with all the will in the world, we would have done a million different things together, and maybe we will in 5 years. So I think it's just keeping the door open.
I think maybe the one specific thing that we came across when we went, not specifically to Groote Eylandt, but before we went to Groote, we went to the University of Melbourne and spoke to the Indigenous Studies team there, because the University of Manchester and Melbourne have a partnership. And one of the things that we were talking to Barry Judd there about was about the support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to create spaces of their own, to share their own cultural material, and that there were gaps. So even in a country like Australia, which is well set up with IATSIS, who have the explicit job and a budget from government to return cultural heritage, there is still a limit, and there are still things that are not supported, that are wanted. So there definitely were things, and there definitely was more. I wouldn't say that we did everything that could have been done, or necessarily everything that was needed, but we did honor the relationship that we had.
Hi, yeah, really interesting about you're talking about applying Indigenous conservation practices, and I just wondered if that's been a sort of if you had been doing that for other groups' cultural material, or if you're now trying to do that or get in touch with groups and sort of apply that, because I'm sure the university has other materials from other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there is a history. I can find notes, I think as far back as 2004, of smoking ceremonies and that type of thing being able to happen here. So that's a part of it, because when you think about Indigenous conservation, it is about the well-being surrounding it, which might be spiritual, it might be connection to individuals, and it might be how you physically kind of care for objects. So there was kind of that well-being aspect for people and objects and ancestors happening in different ways when people reached out. But our hope with kind of making a big splash with the Daddy Quack 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 coming out to play, and the comms team did a pretty good job of trying to spread that story. I am actually quite pleased with them. They're awesome. But that wasn't necessarily for us to be like, wow, look what we've done. It was to inspire that. It was to go, Manchester Museum's willing to do that. Well, I actually know they have some of my cultural heritage, and this is how we would like it cared for. And so we are kind of following also an approach to handling collections, depending on what the collections are and what the risk is that you see elsewhere, especially in settler colonial states, where when it's your cultural heritage material specifically, you don't have to wear gloves, but you kind of require all outsiders too. So there's some of that well-being stuff too. I mean, always warning about, Victorians and their obsession with arsenic, and pesticides that come later, but it is thinking about that well-being and that connection. But we really hope it inspires more people and we get inundated with how we might do that here.
I would say one of the things that meant we did the Indigenising Manchester Museum programme was the fact that we kind of saw things in the first return that we wanted to do more of, and we wanted to build that work out. And so it's kind of it's a trajectory, and there's a kind of expansion of the work. But one of the most meaningful kind of things that sort of stuck with me, because I joined in the middle of the sort of first return, I wasn't my work. I kind of joined at the point of ceremonies happening. Like, I was kind of quite late to the party, but I remember asking people how it had felt, and someone saying to me, "Oh, it was quite hard to step back, not be in the store when." In that case, it was Gangalid and Garo representatives were in the store with their ancestors, and that they sat outside and heard them sing, and they sat outside and waited until it was their time to come in, and they sat outside and let whatever needed to take place in that space happen, and didn't need to know what it was. And actually, that sort of reflection on those sort of practices, it was quite hard, because it's a bit of a professional undoing to not be constantly observing, to not be constantly controlling. And so there's partly that, yes, there are definitely more parts of the collection where we could be obeying kind of Indigenous kind of wishes better in the way that we look after it. But there's also part of the way the curatorial team and the collections team is set up that we need to kind of understand our own sort of professional reaction to it, and kind of work through that as well. So there's two parts to it, really. One is honouring more Indigenous-led conservation wishes, and one is kind of unlearning and relearning ourselves how to still be responsible custodians of the collection, but not quite in the way that we learned to be.
Adam?
Thanks, Jack. I hope I say this the right way. So obviously we can't go backwards. The only thing we can do is go forwards with love and honesty and good intention. And it sounds as if that's exactly what you were doing and trying to do. And it's been really wonderful to hear about. But factually, without value judgment, what you've described in terms of the revitalisation of that art form has happened because you had those collections preserved. And I wondered if the Indigenous community had expressed any perspective about that.
I think we can't share all of the answers of kind of their emotional responses because it's not necessarily been approved. But what I will say is this came out at the time of salvage anthropology. And even though Peter Worsley later becomes the father of social anthropology, Deborah, his daughter, was there at the return and thinks that if he was still living today, he would have been with us spearheading the return because they still have quite close connections. But I think in that context that is where we're one museum in a larger network of colonial taking, that it might be that Manchester Museum's small collection helped with that, but is the reason that wasn't happening was because possibly 50 museums took it all away and so there was nothing to pass on. And I think also if you think about so I think it's hard to answer that and think about it in those ways because the sheer number of things taken and then the legal laws that came in like in Canada where people couldn't practice and objects were taken away. I mean, some of these objects were taken away from people and then given to Peter Worsley and he had to go back to them and pay for them. But they were something that couldn't be returned to the people because of the type of material it was. And so there's a moment where things are just getting taken off of people and there is an intentional break. So I would maybe move away from that type of thinking with that.
I think happening doesn't just apply about it happened before.
Exactly. So I think what it does say is kind of moving away from kind of that is the openness to having these conversations might lead to these types of things. And I think that is the important thing that you're coming onto with that thought is you never know where it will go and it could go to this brilliant place and it could be a part of reconciliation that, I mean, at this point, the museum wasn't the ones that went and took it, but we were the ones that took it as a donation later on. And so I think it is all those different acts of reconciliation. Hopefully, if we're all collectively doing it, can match that collective taking that was happening and kind of build into that. But it is hard to sometimes think about those things when you think about the larger colonial project we're all a part of.
Yeah, I think maybe it's important to say that there was a mission on the island and that there was a deliberate suppression of the culture. So it wasn't the collector that did that, but there was a kind of context, which meant that the continuation likely would have happened if it weren't for the historical context. So it's kind of like the museum taking was part of a bigger historical picture, if you like.
Hello. Just thinking of it in terms of this side of things, when you mentioned that you had a conversation with everybody in Manchester Museum and got everybody's opinions, how did it go? I was just wondering, I don't know how it would work in my own institution and everyone coming from different aspects of different directions, everyone's in different places. How do you acknowledge how they feel? What does that mean in terms of what happens next, in terms of, well, we're going to do it anyway type thing, or are you, or that kind of thing? I was like, it sounded brilliant, but also terrifying all at the same time. I was just really curious how it went.
Yes, was those things. So I'll kind of pass to Alex in a sec, but what I will say is that not everyone felt the same about it. And we weren't trying to make everyone feel the same about it. And actually, if we all felt the same about it, that would be a bit weird. The whole point of bringing kind of different people and different viewpoints into the room is to try and see it from all the angles and acknowledge everyone's place. So, but what people valued was that they'd been part of it. So the return that we did in 2019, 2020, effectively, it was a handful of people who were involved, who kind of kept it quite close to their chests until very close to the end. And then it was like, we're doing this. And everyone else in the institution was a bit like, are we? And so what was appreciated, even if not everyone agreed, and if there wasn't always consensus, was the fact that this time it wasn't done that way, that there was the opportunity for them to see the process earlier, to ask the questions they had earlier, to not be suddenly thrust into a kind of like press and media storm before they'd even really understood what had happened themselves. So I think what I would say is, no, it wasn't like everyone just suddenly went, oh yeah, brilliant, do that. So it isn't like that. But everyone did appreciate that it wasn't just presented as a fait accompli, and that they were part of the conversations for quite a long time before it became a public thing.
And I think what I will say on that kind of collective action part is, you don't get my role with my remit from an institution that isn't largely ready to take that change. So I think when I talk to some people, they're like, oh, wow, you're amazing. I'm like, but you're probably the person at your institution that makes my type of position possible in the future. And so it's just at different organizational moments. And I think because the indigenizing work and the repatriation work was also a part of Hello Future and Esme Ward's vision for the museum, which had been going on for several years before I joined. And then this took us 3 years. So it was happening for 3 years. So it's not that all of a sudden it comes out of nowhere. It takes a long time to do this type of work. So there was a lot of time for people to ask questions at different stages. And I think also really importantly, you could start to have those bigger conversations, because they might be absolutely fine with the Anandiliaco material, which never was exhibited. And, you know, it stayed in the stores from its time in the 80s when it was donated to going back. But it's the bigger conversations that I think people were like, well, then what is the knock-on effect? And that was actually where more of, some of those different ideas were coming up.
Thanks, Faith. We've got time for one more question. I think my observation for a lot of organisations that are making a difference when it comes to thinking more equitably about Indigenous perspectives and colonial legacies is it's often individuals in those organisations that are just doing the work themselves, and then it kind of becomes a thing that the higher ups take up. Although I think in this Museum, Esme certainly seems to be leading from the top of that one as well. But it's, yeah, I think it seems to grow where the institution just grabs hold of what people are just doing in their jobs. But last question from Dia.
Hey, thanks so much. Just amazing to hear about the larger project, the 5 years. I have a question about semantics. So firstly, why you decided to use the word indigenizing, that you made that choice for the whole project versus decolonizing, right? Clearly it's a decolonizing project, but why are you calling it? Well, does that mean that I'm interested in the use of that word and what that word does for you, because I'm also thinking of the time we're living in and the kind of what decolonial does, what can, sorts of, reactions that you can get to that. Is using a word like indigenizing, is it easier to use that word? Does it open up different kinds of conversations or different responses?
I'm going to start with definitions then, George, because I came into a program called that. So you can kind of talk to that. So for me, what's really, really important from an epistemology point of view, and thinking about linguistics and all of that is, so for me, and what my program is trying to establish here is decolonization. The museum is at the center because it's about us unpicking our past. And it's irresponsible for museums to put the onerous and burden on other people that aren't the museum to come and step into that space. Because let's be honest, they're not always, especially if you're just going through decolonization, communities and people that have been marginalized aren't necessarily going to have the decision-making power. So for us, decolonization is about museums facing their own past and making action. Whereas indigenization, that's where you step back. That's where you really think about those decision-making things. And that's where it's led by Indigenous people. And it's coming together with that big systematic decision-making power with how people have that. So I think in the kind of like decolonization does get some people going, whereas indigenization, I think if an institution just started calling it indigenization to kind of step away from the problematic term or that, I think that's another irresponsible move if that isn't attached with also giving Indigenous people agency in the decision-making. I think it will lead to more harm. So that's why those two things are about different decision-making and power structures, and that's why they're very distinct. So even though I was like, because I love semantics, and you opened up a great area for me, but I think in that, it's got to be really purposeful. So some indigenization is decolonization, but some of it is not, because decolonization is unpicking our roots with colonization.
Indigenizing wasn't a choice to try and avoid controversy. It was a choice to foreground Indigenous voices, is the first thing. We did do some things to try and avoid controversy because we live in the world. So there were ways in which we framed the return, which were deliberately done to kind of try and not fall into some of the pitfalls or some of the traps that kind of are out there. And we all know that they are. So there are things that we did in terms of the way that we framed the work that were about trying to kind of lead the story in a positive direction rather than get caught up in a kind of unhelpful, oppositional, right and wrong, bad and good, this person's evil and this person's a hero sort of simplicity. So we tried really hard to keep the nuance in the conversation in the way that we spoke about it. We talk about a gains-based approach, we talk about relationships, we foreground people, and it's much harder to tell an individual who says this matters to me that they are wrong than it is to tell me as a museum professional that I've made a bad decision. My God, people do, so don't worry about that. But like, it's what we didn't want to do was put the Indigenous people we were working with in the position of being on the end of that. So if I'm on the end of that, that's fine. And then we use decolonizing. If it's someone we're working with, we do try and do a little bit of protective work in the way that we frame it to make sure that as far as we can, we don't effectively open people up to more harm through being in those sort of like toxic sometimes conversations. Not that there isn't reasonable debate, and we'll have a reasonable conversation with anyone, and we're all right with different points of view.
Thank you. And it strikes me you're not too shy about kind of using words and inviting debate, like decolonize exclamation mark as your new trail. It's like, yeah, we're here at a very lucky time, not only to get to spend time with these two, but like the Decolonize Trail has just launched, so pick that up. It's around. The Wild exhibition we just heard is open, so make sure you make the most of being here and seeing those things well. I have some notices, but before I give you those, so we can just thank Georgina and Alexandra for